The Alien Academy was known across the galaxy as the best place for learning. It was a school where students from many different species came to study. Some of these species were over 1,000 years old, with wisdom beyond human imagination. But despite all their knowledge, the Academy had one challenge that no one had ever been able to conquer. The challenge was simple: learn 5 of the most difficult galactic languages in just 1 week. It seemed impossible, but the professors at the Academy claimed that it was something no species could ever do. The Academy had tested students from dozens of planets, each with their own unique ways of thinking, but every time they failed. No one could speak 5 galactic languages in only 7 days. The Academy's professors were proud of their teachings. They were the smartest beings in the galaxy, and their knowledge of languages was legendary. They could speak over 50 different galactic languages, from the musical speech of the Syrian species to the sharp, fast sounds of the Venusians. But even they knew that the task of mastering 5 languages in a week was too much for anyone. The Academy held a special ceremony every year where they challenged their students to take on the impossible task. It was meant to push students to their limits, to show them that there were things even the greatest minds could not do. Year after year, species after species, the Academy's professors watched with smug smiles as students tried and failed. The task was impossible, and everyone knew it. But this year was different. A young human named Ethan had just arrived at the Academy. He was not from a powerful species or an ancient race with centuries of knowledge. He was just a human, a young earthling who had somehow made his way to this prestigious school. The professors laughed when they first saw him. A human. He's not even old enough to understand galactic history, let alone learn 5 languages in 1 week. One professor scoffed. The others agreed, shaking their heads. Humans, in their eyes, were still a relatively new species. They had never seen a human do anything extraordinary. They had no reason to believe that Ethan could succeed where the greatest minds of the galaxy have failed. But Ethan didn't mind the laughter. He had grown up in a small town on Earth, where people always told him he couldn't do things. But he never listened to those who said no. He had always believed that humans could do amazing things, no matter how impossible they seemed. And now, he had come to prove it. He was not scared. In fact, he was excited. The challenge was tough, but Ethan liked tough challenges. It made him feel alive. When the professors gave him the task, they did so with an air of superiority. You have 1 week, the head professor, a tall and serious-looking Xorvian, said. 5 languages. Fail, and you will have wasted everyone's time. The other professors watched, waiting to see how the human would react. They expected him to look scared, to hesitate, or even to give up. But Ethan didn't. He simply nodded and smiled. "I'll do it," he said. His voice was steady, and his eyes shone with determination. The professors exchanged glances, some laughing under their breath, while others frowned in disbelief. They had never seen anyone so sure of themselves, but they were certain Ethan would fail. The challenge began the very next day. Ethan was given a list of the 5 languages he needed to learn. The first one was the Xorvian language, known for its complex grammar and fast speech. It was the language of the Xorvian people, and only a few had ever truly mastered it. The second language was the Syrian language, a beautiful yet difficult language filled with emotion-based tones. Then there was the Venusian language, a sharp, rapid language that required quick thinking and even quicker responses. The last 2 languages were known to be some of the hardest, the Garthian and the Tullian languages, both known for their complicated structure and unique sentence patterns. At first, Ethan felt overwhelmed. He sat alone in his room, looking at the strange symbols and sounds on the screen in front of him. These were not like anything he had ever learned back on Earth. They didn't use the same alphabet, and their words didn't even sound like anything familiar. But instead of giving up, Ethan smiled. This was his chance to prove everyone wrong. He started with the Xorvian language. The first thing he noticed was how different it was from English. The sounds were strange, and there were so many different rules. But he didn't let that scare him. He practiced the words over and over, even though they felt foreign in his mouth. The more he practiced, the better he got. By the end of the first day, he could speak simple Xorvian phrases. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The professors were shocked. They had expected Ethan to give up after the first few hours. But instead, he was getting better. By the end of the week, Ethan was sure he could do the impossible. He was ready to prove the Academy wrong. He was ready to show them that humans were capable of greatness. The next morning, Ethan stood nervously outside the Grand Hall of the Alien Academy. The tall, shining doors opened with a soft hiss, revealing a large room filled with beings from all over the galaxy. There were tall, blue-skinned aliens from the Xorvian planet, glowing creatures from the Syrian race, and short, quick-moving Venoxians. Each species had its own unique features and ways of life, but they all had one thing in common. They were all highly intelligent. Ethan had never seen anything like it before. On Earth, he was just an ordinary human with no special powers or abilities. But here, in the heart of the galaxy, he felt small and out of place. He was the only human in the entire academy. And everyone knew it. The other students whispered as he walked past, some laughing quietly behind his back. "Look at him," one Xorvian student said, her voice filled with amusement. "A human here. He's going to fail so quickly." "That's right," another alien agreed. "Humans can't even master their own languages properly. How could he possibly learn 5 alien languages in 1 week?" The words stung, but Ethan ignored them. He had heard similar things on Earth all his life. People often told him that humans weren't good enough, not smart enough, not strong enough. But he didn't let their words stop him then. And he wouldn't let them stop him now. As Ethan stepped into the classroom, he saw the professors sitting at the front of the room. The head professor, a tall Xorvian named Zoreth, stared at him with cold eyes. The other professors were a mix of different species, some with multiple arms, others with glowing skin, and one with 6 eyes. All of them had spent their lives studying languages from across the galaxy. They had never met a human like Ethan, and they didn't think one would be able to succeed. Zoreth cleared his throat. "Today, you will begin your task. You have 1 week to learn 5 of the most difficult languages known to any species. I hope you're ready, human. We expect nothing less than complete failure." His tone was harsh, but there was a hint of curiosity behind his words. It was clear that Zoreth and the other professors were eager to watch Ethan fail. Ethan nodded, his hand shaking slightly, but his heart was filled with determination. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. The class began, and the first language on the list was Xorvian. The Xorvian language was fast, with strange sounds that seemed to twist in the air. Ethan had only heard it a few times on his travels, and it sounded almost impossible to learn. But he wasn't going to give up. He had come too far for that. Zoreth handed him a tablet with a list of basic Xorvian words and phrases. Ethan took a deep breath and began to read. The words were strange, and they seemed to twist his tongue whenever he tried to speak them. But as he practiced, he began to hear the patterns in the language. The strange sounds started to make sense, and slowly he was able to repeat simple words without stumbling. The professors watched in silence. At first, they thought it was a fluke. "He's just repeating words without understanding them," one of the professors muttered. "He can't possibly keep this up." But Ethan didn't stop. Every free moment he had, he practiced. During lunch breaks, he was in the corner of the room, repeating Xorvian phrases. When he was walking back to his dorm, he spoke to himself in Xorvian, ignoring the confused looks from other students. He knew this was just the beginning, and he couldn't afford to waste time. Days passed, and Ethan made steady progress. By the 3rd day, he could understand basic conversations in Xorvian. He could ask for directions and order food in their language. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. He felt a sense of pride with every new word he learned. Meanwhile, the professors were growing more curious. They had expected Ethan to give up by now. After all, no one had ever managed to learn a language as difficult as Sorvian in just a few days. But Ethan was still going strong, his determination pushing him forward. "Maybe he's better than we thought," Zoreth said quietly, watching Ethan from the back of the classroom. "But it's still too early to tell. He's only just started. The real test is yet to come." Ethan didn't care about the doubt in the professor's voices. He wasn't doing this for them. He was doing it for himself. He was doing it to prove that humans could do things no one believed they could. He wasn't going to let anyone tell them that he couldn't succeed. As the days went by, Ethan grew more confident in his abilities. He had learned the basics of Sorvian, and now it was time to move on to the next language, Syrian. The Syrians were a highly emotional species, and their language reflected that. It was full of tones and feelings, and words could change meaning depending on the speaker's emotions. Ethan had a lot to learn, but he wasn't afraid. He was ready to take on the challenge. Little did the professors know, they were about to witness something truly remarkable. A human, with his unique way of thinking and his unshakable will, was about to show them what humans were truly capable of. The first day of learning at the Alien Academy was both exciting and terrifying for Ethan. After the morning meeting with the professors, he was handed a strange tablet with the words Sorvian language flashing across the screen. The language seemed impossible, full of strange symbols and sounds he had never seen before. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to push away the nervous feeling in his chest. He sat down in the classroom, surrounded by students of different species, all of whom had their own ways of studying. Some aliens had tentacles that could move as fast as light, while others had 3 heads that could speak in different languages at the same time. Ethan was the only human, and he felt small and out of place. He couldn't help but wonder what the professors and students thought of him. They had all seen many species try and fail this challenge, and now it was his turn. Ethan took a deep breath and focused on the tablet in front of him. The first lesson was simple, or so it seemed. It taught him how to say hello in Sorvian. The word was long and sounded like a string of clicking noises mixed with soft hums. He tried to say it out loud, but stumbled on the first syllable. It felt like his tongue was too big for his mouth, and the strange sounds seemed to bounce off the walls. The professor, a tall Sorvian named Zoreth, looked at him from across the room with a raised eyebrow. "Not bad for a human," Zoreth said with a hint of sarcasm. "But you'll need to do much better than that if you want to succeed." Ethan nodded, even though he could feel the weight of Zoreth's words. "I'll try harder," he whispered to himself. The day continued, and Ethan struggled to keep up. Every time he spoke, the Sorvian words felt clumsy and foreign. He heard the other students whispering, some of them laughing at how slow he was. "A human can't learn this language," one of them whispered loudly. "He'll never make it." Ethan's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but instead of getting discouraged, he focused even harder. He knew he had to prove them wrong. He had to show that humans could do things that no one believed possible. His mind raced, trying to find a way to learn faster. As the hours passed, Ethan kept practicing. He repeated the words over and over, trying to match the sounds he heard in the lessons. Zorvian, Torin, Lush, and many other words filled his head. The language was tricky, with sounds he had never imagined could exist. But Ethan didn't give up. He kept listening, kept repeating, and kept trying. The other students in the classroom were getting frustrated as they watched him struggle. "He's wasting time," one of them muttered. "We'll all be done long before he gets it." But Ethan was determined to keep going. He pushed aside the doubts and focused on his task. He didn't care about what the other students thought. He cared about proving to himself that he could do it. And with each passing moment, he could feel himself getting just a little bit better. By the end of the day, Ethan could say a few basic phrases in Sorvian. Though they were far from perfect, he still had trouble with the clicks and the smooth hums that the Sorvian language used. But he was proud of how far he had come. It wasn't much, but it was something. and something was all he needed. After class, Ethan went back to his dorm. He was exhausted, but he didn't want to stop. He opened his tablet again, repeating the Xorvian words one more time before bed. He didn't feel ready to give up, not after just one day. He knew it would take time, but he was willing to put in the effort. The next morning, Ethan woke up early. He had barely slept the night before, his mind filled with Xorvian words and sounds. He knew he had to work harder if he wanted to stay on track with the challenge. When he arrived at class, the professors were already waiting. Zoreth looked at him with a skeptical expression. "Did you practice?" he asked, his voice cold. Ethan nodded. "I practiced all night," he said, his voice steady. Zoreth raised an eyebrow, but said nothing more. "Let's see what you've learned." The class began again, and Ethan was determined to prove himself. He practiced more than ever, repeating words in his head and out loud. The language felt less foreign now. The strange sounds that had once been impossible to speak now felt a little more familiar. He was getting better, and even though it was still hard, Ethan knew that if he kept going, he would eventually succeed. At the end of the second day, Ethan felt a small sense of accomplishment. He could speak a few more phrases, and some of the students were no longer laughing at him. A few even gave him small nods of respect. But Ethan wasn't focused on their opinions. He was focused on the task ahead. The road would be long, but Ethan knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to give up. He had a lot to prove, and he was ready to fight for every word, every phrase, and every moment of progress. The first day had been tough, but he was just getting started, and nothing was going to stop him from succeeding. The third day of Ethan's challenge was the toughest yet. His body felt tired, and his mind was exhausted from all the new words and sounds he had been trying to master. But there was no turning back. The Academy's professors had warned him that failure would not be accepted, and Ethan had come too far to quit now. That morning, as he entered the classroom, he could feel the weight of the task pressing down on him. The other students glanced at him with a mixture of pity and doubt. The words human and failure were already starting to echo in the minds of many. It seemed impossible for him to succeed where so many others had failed. Even the professors looked at him with doubt, though they hid it behind their calm faces. Today, Zoreth, the head professor, said in his deep, serious voice, "We will move forward. No more simple words. It's time for full sentences in Xorvian." Ethan swallowed hard. This was it. If he couldn't master full sentences today, there was a good chance he wouldn't be able to keep up. The challenge was growing more difficult with each passing hour, and Ethan had never felt more unsure of himself. But deep inside, there was a fire. A belief that he could do it. He just had to push through. The lesson began. Zoreth handed out new phrases in Xorvian. The words were long, complicated, and full of tones that seemed impossible for Ethan to pronounce correctly. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. The Xorvian language had a rhythm, a beat that made it feel like the words were dancing in the air. But to Ethan, it sounded like noise. The clicks, the hums, and the smooth words blended together in a confusing swirl. Ethan's first attempt was a disaster. He tried to speak the sentence aloud, but the words came out wrong. The tone was off, and he couldn't even complete the sentence without tripping over his own tongue. He heard a few of the students snicker, and his face turned bright red. He felt his confidence slipping away. But then he remembered why he was here. He wasn't going to give up. Not now, not ever. He clenched his fists and took a deep breath. "I can do this," he whispered to himself. "I just need more practice." Ethan decided to take a different approach. Instead of trying to speak perfectly, he focused on understanding the structure of the sentence first. He listened to the tone, the rhythm, and the patterns in the words. Slowly, he began to piece together the meaning. The words were still difficult, but he was starting to understand how they fit together. He repeated the phrases over and over, each time getting a little closer to the right sound. After several attempts, Ethan tried again. This time, his voice was steadier. He spoke with more confidence, even though the words were still a little rough. When he finished, he looked up at the professors, waiting for their reaction. Zorath raised an eyebrow. He was surprised. It wasn't perfect, but it was much better than before. The other professors glanced at each other, clearly impressed by the improvement. "You've made progress, human," Zorath said, his tone colder than usual, but there was a hint of respect in his voice. "You're not as hopeless as we thought." Ethan smiled. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a start. He had made progress, and that was enough to keep him going. But the rest of the day wasn't easy. The phrases kept getting harder, and the pressure was building. Every time Ethan stumbled, he could feel the eyes of the other students on him. They weren't laughing anymore, but they were still watching, waiting for him to fail. But Ethan didn't let that get to him. He focused on the lesson, not the people around him. His mind was clearer now, and he began to recognize the patterns in the language more easily. The sounds weren't so strange anymore, and his tongue began to adapt to the new way of speaking. By the end of the third day, Ethan could speak simple, basic sentences in Sorvian. They weren't perfect, but they were understandable. And that was something no one had expected. The professors seemed to be watching him more closely now, their eyes narrowed with curiosity. Zorath looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "You're improving quickly," he said, "but you still have a long way to go." "I know," Ethan said, his voice steady, "but I'll keep trying. I won't stop." Zorath didn't answer right away. He simply nodded and turned away, his expression unreadable. Ethan could tell that the professor was impressed, even if he wouldn't admit it out loud. And for Ethan, that was enough. He had earned their respect, even if they weren't ready to say it just yet. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone in his dorm, staring at the tablet in front of him. The words and sentences still seemed difficult, but he felt more confident than before. He had made it through the toughest day yet, and now he knew he could do it. He didn't care what anyone else thought. He was going to finish this challenge, no matter what. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Tomorrow was another day, another chance to prove that humans could do the impossible, and Ethan was ready to take it. The fourth day was different. Ethan woke up feeling more confident than ever. The hard work of the past few days had paid off, but there was still much to learn. He knew that if he wanted to succeed, he had to keep pushing himself further. But something inside him had changed. He wasn't just trying to learn the Xorgian language anymore. He was starting to enjoy it. In the morning, as he walked into the classroom, he felt a new sense of excitement. The other students, who had once looked at him with doubt and mockery, were now watching him more carefully. Their whispers had stopped, replaced with curious glances. Ethan had earned their attention, and for the first time, he felt like he belonged. Zorath, the head professor, stood at the front of the room, his cold eyes scanning the students. He noticed Ethan's change in attitude and raised an eyebrow. "Today we'll try a new approach," he announced. "Instead of repeating the same words, we will focus on sentence structure and meaning." The other students exchanged nervous glances. The idea of understanding how sentences were built seemed more difficult than simply memorizing words. But Ethan didn't feel nervous. He was ready for whatever challenge Zorath had in mind. "You will work in pairs," Zorath continued. "Each pair will create a new sentence in Xorvian and then present it to the class." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. A pair. He didn't have anyone to work with. He was the only human in the class, and all the other students were from different species. None of them had spoken to him much before. He looked around, feeling unsure of who to approach. Then, to his surprise, one of the students from the Syrian race walked over to him. She was small, with glowing blue skin and large, round eyes. Her name was Lyra, and she was one of the quietest students in the class. Lyra had been watching Ethan for the past few days and had seen his improvement. She smiled softly at him. "Do you want to work together?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but there was a warmth in her eyes that made Ethan feel more comfortable. Ethan hesitated for a moment but then nodded. Yes, I'd like that. Lyra led him to a table, and they began working on the assignment. As they discussed sentence structures, Ethan realized that Lyra had a different way of learning than he did. She wasn't just memorizing words. She was understanding how everything fit together. She explained that in Syrian culture, learning was based on experience rather than repetition. By using their senses and feelings, they could understand a language more deeply. Ethan was intrigued. He had always thought that learning a language was about memorizing words and rules. But Lyra's method was something new. She suggested that they use their emotions to help understand the Xorian sentences. By imagining how the words would sound if they were happy, angry, or sad, they could understand the tone and meaning behind each sentence. Ethan wasn't sure how it would work, but he was willing to give it a try. They started practicing by creating simple sentences in Xorian. Instead of just repeating words, they focused on how the sentence felt. When they practiced saying a phrase with excitement, the words seemed to come more easily. When they said it slowly and sadly, the meaning changed. It was strange, but it worked. Ethan felt like he was truly starting to understand the language on a deeper level. The words weren't just sounds anymore. They were full of emotion and meaning. And as they continued to practice, Ethan found himself remembering more and more of the Xorian words without even thinking about it. As the class continued, Zorath watched them closely. He was skeptical at first, but as he heard Ethan and Lyra present their sentences, his expression shifted. The sentences weren't perfect, but they were more fluid, more natural. Ethan's progress was becoming undeniable. "You've done well," Zorath said, his voice surprisingly approving. "I didn't expect this method to be so effective. Keep going." Ethan couldn't help but smile. He had expected nothing but failure, but now he was beginning to see success. It wasn't just about memorizing the language. It was about understanding it on a deeper level. And with Lyra's help, he was learning how to do just that. The rest of the day passed in a blur of practice and discovery. Ethan and Lyra continued working together, using the new method to explore more complex sentences. Each time they practiced, the language seemed to make more sense. The Xorian words no longer felt like a jumble of sounds. They had meaning, emotion, and purpose. By the end of the day, Ethan was amazed at how far he had come. He could now speak entire sentences in Xorian with confidence. The professors were watching him more closely than ever, and the other students were no longer whispering behind his back. Some of them even looked at him with respect. That evening, as he sat in his dorm room, Ethan thought about everything he had learned. He had never imagined that learning a language could be so different from what he had known on Earth. He had always thought that languages were just a matter of memorizing words. But now he understood that language was about feeling, experience, and understanding the people who spoke it. Ethan smiled to himself. He still had a long way to go, but now he felt ready for whatever came next. He had found a new way of learning, and it was working. Tomorrow, he would keep pushing himself. There was still more to learn, but with the new methods he had discovered, Ethan knew he could conquer any challenge that came his way. The days seemed to blur together as Ethan continued his journey through the Alien Academy. He had learned so much already, mastering multiple languages, and making friends in ways he never thought possible. But today, the final challenge was waiting for him. The last language. Ethan had been dreading this moment for weeks. It was the language of the Zorathians, a powerful alien species known for their advanced technology and complex culture. The Zorathian language was unlike anything Ethan had encountered before. It was built on layers of meaning, with words that could change depending on the speaker's emotions, intentions, and even their position in space. In short, it was the hardest language in the galaxy. Ethan walked into the classroom, his heart racing. His classmates, many of them species with centuries of experience in language learning, were already sitting in their seats. They were calm, ready for the challenge. Ethan, on the other hand, felt like he might faint from the pressure. "Today, we will begin learning the Zorathian language," Zorath announced, his voice cold and distant. "This is the final test for all of you. Mastering it will not be easy. But remember, some of you will never be able to speak it." Ethan clenched his fists. He knew this was his moment. He had come too far to fail now. The lesson began. Zoreth handed out a holographic screen with the first Jorathian phrase. The symbols on the screen were so intricate that they looked like a series of moving lines and dots, constantly shifting. As Ethan studied the screen, he realized that each symbol held not only a meaning but also an emotion. For example, one symbol could mean peace if spoken in a calm tone, but war if spoken with anger. "Remember," Zoreth's voice rang out, "the Jorathian language is about perception. If you speak it incorrectly, it can have the opposite meaning. Learn to feel the language, not just memorize it." Ethan stared at the symbols, feeling a wave of confusion wash over him. He had always believed that mastering a language was about words and sentences, not emotions. This was different. So different. He focused, determined to make sense of it. He began to repeat the words softly, trying to match the emotion that the symbols represented. The more he spoke, the more it felt like the language was wrapping around his mind, pulling him deeper into its strange world. It was like he was learning to speak with his heart, not just his mouth. By the end of the day, Ethan felt exhausted. The other students seemed to have grasped the concept more quickly, their voices flowing smoothly as they spoke the Jorathian phrases. Ethan, on the other hand, struggled. His sentences were awkward, and the emotion in his voice was still missing. Zoreth looked at him with a mixture of pity and impatience. "You still don't understand, human. The Zorathian language is not something you can simply learn. It's something you must feel." Ethan's heart sank. He had worked so hard, and yet it seemed like it wasn't enough. The weight of failure pressed down on him. But as he sat in the quiet of the classroom, something stirred inside him. A thought, a feeling. Could it be that he had been looking at this language all wrong? He thought back to the lessons he had learned with Lyra and the Syrian way of learning. Emotions, feelings, perhaps this was what he had been missing. The Zorathian language was not just about sound and structure. It was about connection, understanding, and the power of expression. It wasn't enough to just say the words. He had to live them. That night, as Ethan lay in his bed, he closed his eyes and let his mind drift. He tried to feel the words he had learned. He thought about the phrases, not as sentences to memorize, but as messages to communicate. He focused on the emotion behind each symbol. He imagined himself speaking with peace, with anger, with hope. He imagined how those emotions could change the meaning of the words. When the morning arrived, Ethan was ready. He had made a decision. He wouldn't just try to speak Jorathian. He would experience it. He would connect with it. The next class was intense. Zoreth stood before the class, watching Ethan closely as he stood up to speak his first Jorathian sentence. This time, when Ethan spoke, he didn't just focus on the words. He let himself feel the meaning behind them. When he spoke the word for peace, he felt calmness wash over him. When he spoke the word for strength, he felt a surge of power. And when he spoke the word for change, he felt the weight of transformation. As he finished the sentence, there was a moment of silence in the room. Zoreth's cold eyes widened slightly. He had never expected Ethan to succeed, let alone speak with such clarity. For the first time, the other students looked at him with genuine respect. They could feel the emotion in his words. Zoreth walked up to Ethan, his expression serious but thoughtful. "You've done something unexpected, human," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You have learned the Zorathian language in a way that no one else has." Ethan smiled, feeling a wave of pride. He had done it. He had felt the language. The challenge was over. And despite the odds, Ethan had proven that even the most difficult languages could be learned with the right heart and mind. Ethan woke up to a quiet, still morning. It was the final day of the challenge. He had made it this far. And now the only thing left to do was to prove that he could truly master all 5 galactic languages. The weight of the last few weeks rested heavily on his shoulders, but he felt a sense of calm he hadn't expected. He had already learned more than he thought possible. Now, it was time to show the Academy that humans were capable of the impossible. As he walked into the classroom that morning, the atmosphere was different. The usual nervous tension in the air had been replaced with anticipation. The other students were sitting in their seats, their eyes fixed on the front of the room. Zorath stood by the main screen, his eyes scanning the students, but his gaze lingered longer than usual on Ethan. "You have all completed the training for your respective languages," Zorath announced. "But now we must see how you perform when you are truly tested." Ethan felt a jolt of nervous energy. The final test was here. The professors had decided to combine all 5 languages into one challenge. Ethan would have to speak each language, switching between them seamlessly. He had to use the correct tone, structure, and emotion. It was the ultimate test of his abilities, and the pressure was on. Zorath called the first student to stand. It was a Zorathian named Taylor. Taylor had been one of the strongest students in the class, known for his sharp mind and quick learning. Taylor stepped up confidently, reciting the 5 languages one after another, each sentence flawless. The other students watched with admiration as Taylor finished. He sat down with a smug look on his face, clearly proud of his performance. Next, it was Ethan's turn. His heart pounded in his chest. He took a deep breath and stood up, facing the entire class. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him, the weight of their expectations heavy in the air. The first language was Korkian. The words were already familiar to him now. He focused on the structure, the rhythm, and the emotions behind them. As he spoke, he felt the language flow from his mouth with ease. The words sounded natural, and the tone matched the meaning perfectly. He could feel the eyes of the professors on him, but he pushed it out of his mind. Next came the Syrian language. This one was harder for Ethan, but he remembered his lessons with Lyra, the emotion that came with it. He spoke slowly at first, carefully choosing his words. The sentences weren't perfect, but they carried the right feeling. As he finished, he felt a surge of confidence. He was getting the hang of it. The third language was the most difficult, Zorathian. Ethan had struggled with it before, but now it felt different. He focused on the emotional aspect, remembering how he had felt when he first began to connect with the language. This time, the words came with more meaning. He felt the strength, the peace, and the power of the language fill him. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than before. Now, only 2 languages remained. The fourth language was Salrathian, a complex language with strange sounds and symbols. Ethan had practiced it in his free time, but it had never come easily. He took a deep breath and began to speak, letting his emotions guide him. At first, the sounds felt foreign, but as he continued, he found a rhythm. The words began to form properly. It wasn't flawless, but the meaning was clear. He was starting to feel like he was truly understanding it. Finally, the last language, Zenthian. This language was the one that had given him the most trouble. It was fast, with rapid changes in tone and structure. Ethan had struggled to get a handle on it, but today was different. He had learned to think with his heart, to feel the language, not just speak it. When he began, he focused on the emotions tied to each word. The more he spoke, the more the language came to life. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best he had ever done. When Ethan finished, the room fell silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. Ethan stood there, his heart racing. He had done his best, but would it be enough? Zorath was the first to speak. He walked to the front of the room, his eyes narrowing as he examined Ethan closely. The other professors were watching too, their faces unreadable. After a long pause, Zorath finally nodded. "You have done it," he said, his voice low. "Against all odds, you have mastered all 5 languages." Ethan's heart soared. He had done it. He had proven that humans were capable of things no one thought possible. The other students who had once doubted him now looked at him with respect. Even Taylor, who had been so confident, seemed to recognize Ethan's achievement. "You've proven something," Zorith continued, his voice softer now, "that even the most difficult challenges can be overcome with persistence, heart, and a willingness to learn. You've shown that humans are more than capable." Ethan smiled, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. It had been the hardest challenge of his life, but he had made it. He had faced the impossible and come out victorious. The rest of the students stood and applauded. It wasn't just for Ethan's success. It was for the lesson they had all learned. They had witnessed the power of determination, the strength that comes from learning, and the incredible potential of humans. Ethan had shown them all what was possible when you never gave up. As Ethan stood there, listening to the applause, he realized that this victory wasn't just his own. It was a victory for all humans, a victory for perseverance, heart, and the belief that anything could be achieved.